I've been a knowledge practitioner from several sides. I started out working in agricultural extension, then in policy, then in consultancy, then in research management, and now and research funding. And now I feel as though the wheels turn full circle, because for the first time in my life I'm an academic. And I guess the lessons I've learned over the last 30 years is that there's a great deal of value to be added through having skilled professionals working at the interface between, actually it's not a very narrow interface between science and practice. It's a very broad spectrum, and skilled professionals can work in various niches across that whole spectrum and add enormous value. One of the metaphors that I've often used is, I think all of us are familiar with org charts. You know, they have a whole bunch of boxes, or an organisational diagram, or a system diagram with boxes connected by lines. Usually the lines have some form of arrow, and usually the arrow is expected to represent communication or knowledge flow or whatever. And I always ask to see the budget of the initiative or the organisation or whatever, and inevitably when you look at the budget, all the money's in the boxes. So the boxes represent functional areas or people or whatever. And my next question then is, so where's the money for the arrows? And very often we just expect communication or interaction to happen between different functional areas. And this is in particular if you're looking at systems where people have to work across organisations, across jurisdictions, across sectors, or across countries. It's fundamental that we actually have appropriate resourcing for the arrows. And if we expect there to be a lot of interaction, a lot of meaningful communication, then you actually have to ensure that there's resources, not just money, not just people, but to actually invest in the time to enable those things to take place. So when I was Chief Executive of Land and Water Australia, at one stage for an experiment we ran an initiative where we reversed the budget and put all the money in the arrows, and we made the boxes compete, or in fact they had to collaborate in order to get the money out of the arrows. And I must say it was great fun, but it wasn't something we repeated. But in terms of getting people to change their thinking, I don't think anyone involved in that ever wrote a budget the same way again, and that was the intent. These days, however, I think, and it's not terribly helpful to generalise what the perfect knowledge practitioner is or what skills they need to have. It's incredibly context dependent. And so for me, some of the lessons are, take the time to really understand the context in which you're working. Be extremely clear about the objective that you're trying to achieve. And quite often for that person in a broking role or a facilitating role or an intermediary role, it's really important that you're transparent about what your own objectives are. Because if people perceive that you have a hidden agenda, that you're secretly working for some other player, then there's likely to be a lack of trust, and that's toxic for effective knowledge processes. For professionals working in the sector, I think it's really important to take time out also to sharpen the saw, as it were, to continually rebuild your skills and to find out what's happening elsewhere. And that's particularly the case now that we're in a very fast-moving Web 2.0 towards Web 3.0 environment. And the tools that we have available now for knowledge sharing and for sophisticated ways of making knowledge discoverable and accessible and usable and able to be integrated into various processes, the tools are just mind-blowing. And so there's always something else you can be aware of if you take the time out. In terms of the biggest challenges, for me, one of the really tricky ones is the question of evaluation. it's hard enough to evaluate the return on investment for a particular research project. So for a particular innovation or insight or piece of knowledge, it can take many years, if not decades, to fully understand how the value of that particular piece of information or discovery. And that's problematic in and of itself. To try and work out what proportion of that value was added by the bit of intermediary work along the way is very challenging indeed, and I've even tried to design experiments where you might be able to try and measure that experimentally, and it's very problematic. So that will be a perennial challenge, I believe, is to show how much a return on investment for organisations or systems that devote resources to the intermediaries, the professional intermediaries between knowledge generation and knowledge practice. By the way, I think the distinction between the notion that we produce knowledge somewhere and apply it somewhere else is not terribly helpful, because generally we have in very well-running systems, practitioners are involved in knowledge generation and use, and professionals are involved in generation and translation and interpretation and use as well. So it's better to think about in terms of co-production of knowledge than scientists or experts generating it and passive recipients taking it up and applying it somewhere else. Another challenge, or perhaps best described as one of the key insights from one of the workshops here at the K-STAR conference, was that you can fall into the trap of trying to generalise, this is the approach you use for a particular sector, or this is a challenge with policy. In my experience, the differences within a sector can be just as big as those between them. And also, even if you take something as apparently simple as the interface between science and policy, not all policymakers are the same, not all policy audiences are the same. I've worked with, say, different ministers of the environment in Australia, one of whom would think nothing of reading 500 pages, and the successor wanted nothing in more than a page. So just to think about how you produce information to try and inform a single position can vary radically between incumbents. And so again, take the time out to understand the context and to work out what approach is likely to be most effective. So for skilled knowledge practitioners, you're likely to have a whole tool bag of approaches and tricks and tools and insights. And the real skill is being like the master chef of working out which ingredients are likely to be most effective in most combinations, in which combination for a particular context. So then the really important skills then become the ones of context diagnosis, how to work out what's going on in a particular situation, and therefore what approaches are likely to be most effective. And that's where experience is, you can't beat experience for that.